You're listening to Psych with Mike. For more episodes or to connect with the show with comments, ideas, or to be a guest, go to www.psychwithmike.com. Follow the show on Twitter @PsychWithMike or like the Facebook page @PsychWithMike. Now, here's Psych with Mike.
Welcome into the Psych with Mike library. This is Dr. Michael Mahan. I am here with Mr. Brett Newcomb.
Good morning.
How are you, Mr. Brett?
I'm perplexed.
Yeah, you're perplexed because?
Well, everything's going on in the world today. It's just very concerning to me.
Yeah. Well, we're going to get answers today.
Pick a card, pick any card.
Yeah. Because we have with us someone who we've had on before who is now, dare I say, a friend of the show, and somebody that I'm hoping is going to be able to help us to elucidate some answers, and that is Harvard fellow Mr. Eric Kaufmann. How are you, Eric?
I'm with Brett. I'm delighted to be with you. I'm perplexed. I'm sad. I'm mad. I'm heartbroken.
Yeah.
And still insistently hopeful through all that.
Yes.
So before we get into that conversation, Eric, why don't you refresh our memories a little bit about you and what you're doing and what's going on in your life?
I am engaged on a day-to-day basis with executives, helping them make better decisions and form the kind of relationships within their organizations that help them accelerate the results that are meaningful to their business. So I'm an executive coach, executive team facilitator, and my focus is on leadership. Mm-hmm. How do we wield influence in such a way to produce meaningful results? Mm-hmm. And but yes, I'm caught right in this moment, very much in what we're all experiencing, right? This kind of unleashing of the shadow side of our human experience that has gone from invisible to taking up all our visibility. Mm-hmm. I'm aware that these inequities and inequality and these treatments of cruelty and misbehaviors are being sort of put on trial in a public way, but they're also happening day to day in every team and in every business. People behave poorly and badly. They mm-hmm. treat people unkindly, and just as much as it is ripping the fabric of our society with this sort of consistent lack of kindness and consciousness, every organization suffers in the same way because these are micro and macrocosms. And so I think having a conversation about how do we bring more conscious leadership to the business, to our communities, to our households, is one that's not theoretical, but right now it's existential.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that really strikes me about what you do is that unlike what maybe people would consider the quote traditional way of going in and doing this kind of consultation work where you're looking at the bottom line, maybe giving a head bob to let's treat people equitably, let's treat people fairly. That's really the foundation of what you do. And I just want to share that since the last time that we talked, I reached out to you and said, I'm really going through some things in my life that I'd like to try and figure out. And you graciously volunteered an hour of your time and took me through a part of the process that you do with these leadership individuals and the experience of that is profound. I can only assume that if you do that on a larger corporate level, that you're really challenging these individuals to look at themselves in a foundationally different way than a lot of other corporate trainers, corporate coaches are doing.
Yes, I believe it was Buckminster Fuller who might have said that there is no organizational transformation without personal transformation. And transformation is a fascinating word because at some level it can just be a BS marketing slogan, right? We'll transform you. But I hold it as a matter of sort of assumption for me in my work that there's a distinction between information and transformation, right? And information is knowledge and transformation is change. And so for that change to take root, there's got to be something that shifts within us. I have to make some change in order for me to be able to change circumstances in the world around me. Or to quote, Einstein, a problem cannot be solved at the same level of consciousness that created it. And that's true for a math problem as much as it's true for a strategic problem, as much as it's true for a social problem. We can't expect from the same place. Again, I'll quote another anonymous, right? The anonymous, insanity is defined as doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. And if we think about that differently, insanity is, thinking the same thing over and over and expecting different outcomes. So if you want different outcomes, you have to shift the mindset. And once your mindset shifts, the world changes, because we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. And so if I want the world to look differently, I have to adjust the lenses of my eyes, and that doesn't happen just with glasses, it happens with our mindset.
So just setting the context, we're talking right now in a time where the world is continuing to deal with the pandemic of the coronavirus, but we've also now had the George Floyd situation. I'll say murder because that's how I think of it. If other people are offended by that, then that isn't my intent. But and the resulting civil unrest that's associated with that. And it feels to me, and I don't know if you gentlemen will agree with this, but it feels to me like this is different than 9/11 or different than other opportunities that we've had in our society to look at ourselves and say, who are we? How do we want to see ourselves? How do we want to be going forward? This feels to me like it's different, and I don't know, only time's going to tell if it is, but it feels to me like it's different. Does it feel different for you guys?
Too early to tell for me. I don't know.
Yeah.
I see systemic issues that have been known since man's been around and don't seem to have changed. They are resistant. Example that comes to mind is Stanley Milgram and his experiments on obedience to authority. What I'm aware of about Milgram's experiments, I don't know, Eric, if you're familiar with them, but he did research after World War II to say, why would ordinary, everyday German people become concentration camp guards and perpetuate all the indignities and wickedness that happened there? And he said, well, I need to do a study of the German people. There must be something in their character that's wrong. And then he said, but before I go, I need to get a baseline. I need to find out, what happens in a good country with good people. So he's going to conduct these experiments in the United States. And he did. And what he found was that almost everybody that participated would go to the extremes that they were told to go to because of the presence of an authority that just said, oh, you have to continue. I'm the authority, and that's what I'm saying. There was only one categorical group that consistently refused to do it, and that was ministers of all faiths. And they didn't do it. They didn't participate. But everybody else did. Policemen, shopkeepers, lawyers, doctors, it didn't matter, because authority represented power, and they just followed it. And I think that's still here today.
So for people who may not be aware, Milgram, basically the experiment was that he put a person in a room who was in control of a device that would electrically shock a person in another room. And the people who were being shocked were actors, and so they weren't
really
getting shocked, but they would pretend. And so as the intensity of the shock went up, these actors would pretend to actually be getting shocked, and at the highest level, they would actually pretend to be in excruciating pain, even death. And people would continue to escalate the amount of shock that they were applying. When told by an authority figure to do so, there were very, very few people who would actually refuse. And that was a very elucidating experiment.
I think you bring out a really interesting point, Brett, about the clergy as being unwilling to participate in that kind of instruction that they were giving. And I presume, I don't know the research, but in my imagination, I'm assuming that they align themselves with an authority that was different than the authority in the room next door giving them instructions.
So I don't know that was their explanation, but as the experiments continued, Milgram was really shocked at the results that he was getting, so he kept intensifying the exposure. He moved people into the same room, he moved them closer, he made them physically take the hand of the person and hold it down on a button to receive the shock. And all that he ever did to force that was wear a doctor coat and say, the experiment must continue. The ones who refused were ministers. And what frightens me today is so many ministers of different faiths who embrace the messages of Donald Trump. I don't understand that. I don't have a context for understanding that. And especially when we look at the troubles today and ask ourselves, what's my role? What's my responsibility? How can I get through today without doing that kind of harm? Is there A, without doing harm, and B, can I do something positive somehow, some way? And I think that's an important question to ask every day.
Well, but I think that for me, this goes back to what Eric was talking about last time we were together, which was this responsibility that we all have individually to be the shepherds of our own conscience and the shepherds of our own willingness to either be a follower or be a leader. But, Lisa Murkowski came out today and said, I don't think that I can vote for the president. And his response to that was, well, I'm going to run against you 2 years from now. And I think that that's what is happening, is that the response from the current administration, whenever there's anybody who holds up a hand of dissent, is we'll railroad you.
Yeah.
Over, and you can't stand against the combined weight of the force of our power. And then people say, oh, well, I can't stand up against the combined weight of the force of their power, so I'm just going to go ahead and not say anything. I may not support them, but I'm not going to openly defy them. And we haven't found anybody who is willing to openly defy the message that's being
So whatever happened to the statement, I was looking for a job when I found this one. I have to be true to me, what I believe, what I believe is right, and if I lose my job because of that, so be it. And that's a grandiose kind of thing to say, and I understand that people have bills and responsibilities and lives and other agendas, but I do believe there is a certain level of evil that starts to outweigh those things, and somebody has to step up and say, not me.
Well,
not today.
Whether it's evil or not, Eric, I really liked what you had sent us, the text of a letter that you had written to some of the clients that you work with, and what you talked about was this idea, this concept of cruelty. And could you talk to us a little bit about that and what you meant when you were talking about that in your letter?
Yeah, because much of the conversation we're having is, and whether we call it racism or we call it bigotry or anti-Semitism or xenophobia or chauvinism, there's different terms that we have, but essentially there's a mistreatment of others, and it's a form of cruelty. Cruelty is, causing harm and pain on other people. When that officer choked Mr. Floyd to death, that wasn't justice. That was cruelty. That was a profound mistreatment of another human being. And those who stood by, the three officers that stood by there and watched, were participating in cruelty. If they weren't doing it by commission, doing it themselves, they were doing it by omission, by permitting this to happen around them. And I think that the Trump administration in particular has refined the use of cruelty as a bludgeon, right? As just simply as a kind of a blunt instrument with which they beat the Jesus out of their people. And what we're seeing in part in this kind of explosive social action, I believe is 100% a result of this pent up cruel treatment for 400 years. But it's not just the African Americans that are being sort of feelings cruelty, but there's lots of people who have been the subject of cruel behavior, and increasingly cruel behavior, by the administration in this particular case, and in their lives in general. Cruelty has been perpetrated upon us on a constant basis. I talk with thousands of leaders and executives, and it's remarkable to me. It is remarkable to me the amount of cruelty that they endured as children, the amount of alcohol abuse that happens in households, and what happens to those children that are being treated cruelly, and how that perpetuates and goes on from generation to generation, and from home to work, and from work back to other people's homes. And so I think that this behavior that is callous and that causes pain and suffering has many different faces. And I think if there's a path for us, then it's the path of identifying that cruelty, naming that cruelty, and taking action, with collective action and individual action, to replace that cruelty with a higher function of what it means to be a human being.
I agree.
Cruelty resides within me. I'm aware of the cruelty and the cruel tendencies that I have, and I have 3 brothers. I know that I was cruel to them as a youngster, and I know that I've done things that were, pain and something that I caused pain to other people. But I work diligently on a daily basis to become more of an agent of love and care and creativity and compassion than cruelty. Cruelty can come from ignorance. Cruelty can come from fear. But it's all around us.
But what about the idea that cruelty is in the eyes of the beholder? And so people who support the current administration might say, well, I feel like that people treated me cruelly before this current regime took power. And now people will say, so I'm protecting myself against going back to that time. How do we, where is there a universal kind of objective good that we can all agree on and say, see, anything that's against this is definitively objective cruelty? I just think that that's so perceptually based that it's impossible to get 100% of people to agree.
Yeah, I agree. And, every sort of major tradition says that, those of us who are within the tradition, right, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, you name it, right, those of us within our tribe are right, and those outside the tribe are wrong.
Xenophobia all over again.
Yeah, and so the universal, I think, I'll tell you about my experience. I don't know about the philosophy. My experience is the more I have learned to recognize my boundaries, my own sort of identity boundaries, and the more I've learned to extend those boundaries so that they don't just sort of define the skin boundary of my body or the constructive boundary of my family, but the more I've found that the connection and interconnection with other people is real, the easier it's been for me to be supportive and to be compassionate, because it's that sense of interconnectedness, the diminishing sense of separate self, because at some level that to me is the linchpin of this whole operation. It's this fundamental notion of a separate self and the existential anxiety about my survival that then generates this permission that I have to protect this sense of self. And often protecting the self means destroying that which is a threat. And so the universal, I think, is not so much an agreed upon single idea as much as this spiritual unfolding and the recognition of the interconnectedness of all of life. Now, this might sound fanciful, or it might sound new agey, or it might sound liberal. It isn't. It's scientific. It's, quantum physics has demonstrated the interconnectedness of all of life. Mm-hmm. Every form of science, the butterfly effect and the various terms that they have for it, has demonstrated that the system is one large interconnected system with multiple nodes of measurable experience. And so it is with human beings, but we are wrapped in an ego shell, this I, and this ego shell is the sort of central feature of our sense of separateness. Every leader that is coming from this I and I need and I alone is highly identified with their ego and is going to spread this sense of fear and anxiety and cruelty. And so at some level, the question is systemic, to Brett's point, right? How do we create systems that generate equity and fairness? But again, there is no organizational transformation without personal transformation.
And I think that sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we have a duty to do our work, our spiritual evolution, so that we can rise, not ignoring the ego, because that's just a non-starter conversation, but transcending.
Yeah, so I have the obligation to be the best me. And I have to work to find out what that means and to behave in honor of it. And what I was saying earlier is if I don't have a position of authority and power within the system so that I can impact a major segment, I still have the authority over me to do what I can do today differently or better. And there is a momentum of the preponderance of weight of all of us individually doing that will change the system. So I don't have to be the president, I don't have to be a senator, I just have to be a person that says, today it's me, today it's this. And if enough of us do that, things will change.
And I love what you said. I'll add a very, very practical element, right? Because I can talk about spiritual growth and we can talk about sort of the ego and so forth. But let me make this like super, super practical. Somebody once asked me, if you had all the resources in the world and you wanted to change and make the world a better place, what would you do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I said, I'll tell you, it's very simple of what I would do. I would fund travel.
Yeah.
I would fund the kind of experiences for people to leave their home, their village, their town, their country, and have immersive experiences in other countries and other cultures. And I would do this not just so that they drive in a bus and look at the monuments and look at the antiquities,
yes. Yeah.
But I would do it in such a way that they go into people's houses and have coffee and have lunch and have dinner with them, have a conversation with them. They travel the seaside and the mountainside together with their hosts from this foreign country.
Yeah.
Because what happens when you get out of your bubble, right? So the ego is me, and then my bubble is my egoic sort of extension, right? Mm-hmm. My family, my tribe, my city, my I, me. As soon as you start encountering other humans in a meaningful way, what you begin to discover, inevitably, every human experiences this. I don't care where you're from. You begin to discover the remarkable similarity.
Yes.
Xenophobia, sexism, chauvinism, anti-Semitism, racism, those are often just features of isolation and lack of exposure. And if we want to have a richer, more vibrant interaction among people, we need to get people to be engaging with each other, not just in riots on the streets, but in meaningful exchanges. If we can set up a series of dinners across cultures, you have enough dinner with any other person and you begin to discover, oh my gosh, mm-hmm. you're much more like me than you're separate from me.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I think, and from a leadership perspective, I think the power of what a leader can do, one of the most profound things that a leader can do, is generate an environment within which meaningful conversations take place.
I think that's
true whether you're talking about strategy, that's true whether you're talking about operational excellence, and it's 100% true when you're talking about social change. We have to create meaningful conversation. And if you're talking about this administration or any political party, one of the most profound tools that a politician has to wield power is to create distance and separation. This country is going through a profound weakening by virtue of this unrelenting divisiveness.
Yes.
Because the more you divide, it's not just, the more you divide, the weaker you become, because the fabric that interconnects the capacity to have collective action, which is far more powerful than individual action, that goes away in division. And what you now have is fighting and not conversation. So if there's one thing on a super practical level that we can do as leaders, is we can engender conversations, by engaging them. So every one of your listeners, every one of my friends, my family, you and I, rather than just talking to the people that we're accustomed to talking to, we can extend our network and talk to people we're not accustomed to talking to, people who are not exactly like us, that are just an echo chamber returning ourselves back to ourselves and confirming our bias. We're talking to people who are unlike us. And that power of conversation, leaders can actually enhance that. Or, as we see in the case of particularly, the Trump and his administration, they're doing everything in their power to thwart meaningful conversation among people of different opinions. We're seeing what we're seeing.
I grew up in a small Southern church, Christian church, and one of the more common things that I would hear on occasion is that the preacher was speaking to the amen corner, only to those that agreed with him, only to those that were in his pile, and not to the rest of us. And I think what you're saying is a real apt description of what's going on in the country today. The divisiveness is destructive and wicked, and we have to do something to see our commonality. However we can. I think your idea is about dinners or travel, and you don't have to go to Kathmandu. I mean, you can go to Festus, Missouri. You can go the next town down the road. Meet people where they live, learn how they live and how they see the world and how they are like you, with your fears, your hungers, your angers, your happiness, your joy. We find commonality if we look for it. And I think that is one of the beautiful things about therapy. Mike and I are both clinical. I know your wife is also clinical. Sitting in a room with somebody week after week and learning to see them as they take off their masks makes us have respect and compassion and love for them that we might not have if we passed them on the street and didn't know these things about them. We have to spend time getting to know people to discover the commonality. And I think that, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but I think that's what you're talking about.
It's exactly what I'm talking about. And the fact that you brought up the word love, I think, is a very important feature of this conversation, because I write about this and I work with this in my own life and with clients. Is love, and I wrote that in that note that I sent you, Mike, as well, right? Love it's a feeling, it's an emotion, it's also a behavior. Mm-hmm. And one of the remarkable sort of demonstrable behaviors of love, in fact, is to listen to people, because, I'll put it simply. When I tell you that, I got a new car a couple of years ago and I love my car. Well, that's not unusual. Why do you say I love my car? Well, what does it mean that you love your car? Well, for one, I don't park it anywhere near other people, because those dings and bangs are unacceptable, right? I wash the car, I take care of it, I change the oil. I love it. So what does it mean? It means that I give it attention. Mm-hmm. I know it's an inanimate object, but basically, anytime I say I love something, it means that my attention flows towards it. I love my wife. What does that mean? It means I give her my attention. I love my kids. I love my job. What happens when I don't love my car anymore? Because it's now been 2 or 3 or 4 years and it just doesn't hold my attention the same way. Mm-hmm. I'm not quite washing it as often. I haven't vacuumed it in a long time. I've got a ding, which I'm not fixing, right? I just stopped giving it attention. And I think we can practice love by giving attention. When you say what's happening in the therapeutic, and I forget, I wish I could remember who said this, but there's somebody said that being listened to is so powerful that it's often indistinguishable from being loved. Right? And what can we do as leaders? What can we do as humans? What can we do in this time? Is not just retreat into the sort of the familiar sound, in other words, the words and values and conversations that we're having, but to give attention outside of us. Because if I give attention, if I listen with curiosity, if I listen with a sense of presence, I discover what's lovable in the other.
With your permission, I'd like to read that sentence that you sent in the letter to us.
Sure.
Under practice love. I feel love, and I also practice love behaviors. Specifically, I practice compassion, doing something to relieve another's suffering, and I practice deep listening, giving my full attention to someone. And I think that's what you just said, and you said it beautifully, and I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah, thank you. And so that's an act of leadership, right? An act of leadership is extending beyond myself into another in order to affect some kind of change. I mean, the leader is somebody who influences people to change their behavior.
Yeah.
And by extending myself and listening and connecting and practicing that form of love, I will cause change. And in this case, we're talking about social change as much as we're talking about organizational or team change.
Yes.
And we've gone super long compared to what we usually do, which is fantastic because this has been a great conversation. The place where I would like to leave this is on that note. I feel like that this has been a very somber but a very heartfelt conversation, and I want to leave it there on that note of love, that's what we want to try and encourage other people to wrap their heads around. How can each of us demonstrate love today? Love for ourselves, love for another. Are we going to be courageous enough to try and love those people who may seem to be so disparate from us? We may not have anything in common with that person. How can we allow ourselves to look at that person and feel love? And for the sake of complete self-disclosure, Eric, that was what I got out of the hour that you and I spent together. And I know that you are aware of this because you were a part of it. But that, this idea for me, the idea of universal love is really the answer. And it's easy for us to say that. We can go on Oprah's show and we can say, oh yeah, love is the answer. But what does that mean? Well, exactly what you and Brett have just been discussing. How do we go about showing that behavior? That's what's essential. We can say we love somebody or we love something, but we know we do when we show that behavior, when we show that compassion, and we give them our attention. And if we're not doing that, then we're not really loving that person. So anyway, that is going to be a wrap for today's Psych with Mike, and I hope that people got something out of that. As always, you can get a hold of us through psychwithmike.com. You can get us on YouTube, Psych with Mike. You can follow us on Twitter at Psych with Mike, and you can also like our Facebook page at Psych with Mike. And as always, if it's Friday, it's Psych with Mike.